Do you feel like you have to be perfect? Do you feel like you struggle with perfectionism, but really what you want is to live in excellence and you're not quite sure which is which and if you're actually in excellence or if you're striving for perfectionism? Well, if so, that's what we're going to be talking about today on Boldly Driven Conversations with Bree. Okay, so it's always so interesting to me how I think about something that I want to talk about lately, and then like literally my life kind of follows that thing that I want to talk about. And this has happened to me a lot whenever I've written about things, thought about things, taught different aspects of different areas of life. I end up experiencing that thing that I want to talk about. And so today we're going to be talking about the fine line between perfectionism and excellence. And it's really interesting to me how I've been thinking about this subject for actually the last probably like week or two. And then somebody on one of my socials mentioned that there is a difference between perfectionism and excellence. And that's all they said. It was like a one-liner thing. And I was like, yes, that is so true, because that's literally what I've been thinking about lately. And then I had a conversation with a friend this morning on my way into work. And literally the whole conversation was surrounded by this idea of perfectionism and not wanting to try to strive for perfectionism, but rather wanting to live in excellency, and how there's such a fine line there. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I feel like this has been something I have been wanting to talk about. This is something that I struggle with. And this is something that we're just going to talk about it. Okay. We're just going to talk about it. So there is a fine line between perfectionism and excellence. So both involved having high standards, but they really differ from one another significantly in their underlying motivations and their outcomes. So we're going to kind of be discussing that and how they are different in a lot of ways. Okay, so first, perfectionism. So perfectionism is that double-edged sword, okay? It's very fear-based. The motivation is the fear of failure, not wanting to fail. And we strive for perfection so that we can receive external validation from other people, right? And it's an all or nothing way of thinking. We strive for flawlessness. But the problem with it is that there is then a paralyzation by fear. We get paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. As an Enneagram 3 Wing 2, I identify with this so much. And this is why I really struggle with that fine line between perfectionism and excellence, because I have a huge fear of failure, and it's gotten so much better. But a lot of things in my life have been really triggering this fear of failure, this liminal space I'm in, and all these transitions in my life. My rude brain constantly is pointing me towards failure. And so I've had to have this really work on having this mind shift of not striving for perfectionism and really sitting back and being, just being, and allowing flow to happen so that I can reach excellence. Perfectionism, we are super self-critical when we are striving for perfectionism. And this leads us to so much negative talk, and which leads us to low self-esteem. And this is a cycle that I found myself in for so many years of not being approved. I was part of this organization, and I was told often that I was approved and that I didn't have to work for approval. I was told this by words, but the actions didn't always follow up with it. And that was the conundrum of it. That was where the rubber met the road. And I realized it was a trigger for me for wanting to strive for perfection instead of excellence. And I really flirted with that line so often, and that is what contributed to my burnout. When we are trying to strive for perfection, this oftentimes will lead to procrastination. It leads to procrastination because we want everything to be perfect. And if we can't do it perfect, then we don't do it. And if we have this fear of messing up and making mistakes, and we're going to be judged or criticized for it, or removed from something, or told no, or not seen and loved for who we truly are, then we're not going to do it. And we're just the fear of not meeting others' expectations. But then there's this underlying inner work that needs to happen where we are not meeting our own unrealistic standards. We have these unrealistic standards for ourselves when we're trying to be perfect and living in perfectionism that we cannot meet. So then we fear starting, because even we know we can't meet them, but we won't change our expectations for ourselves. We have these super high standards for ourselves. And this is what I experienced in my life. And this was absolutely a contributor to my burnout. When we are in this place of perfectionism, trying to be the best and striving to be perfect and not make any mistakes and not disappoint anybody, the whole people pleaser thing, there's so much stress and anxiety. It's a constant pressure that causes significant stress and anxiety. It literally affects our body. It becomes chronic stress and anxiety. It affects our physical health, mental, emotional, and our spiritual health for sure. And so there's this idea of there is no rest allowed, and it's never ending. Like the striving never ends. And rest becomes this idea, this thing that we have to earn rather than a thing that is a requirement. And so I've been using this phrase for a few years now, well, a couple of years now, since the burnout started for me, and I realized that what it was, and I, started to work into recovery and whatnot, that rest is not a reward. Rest is a requirement, not a reward. And we don't have to earn rest. It is absolutely a requirement as being just a human. If you're a human, you need rest. Absolutely. And it's not, I have to do all these things and then I will rest. I've really been changing my mindset of I need to rest so that I can do these things. And that has been such a game changer for me, for my emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical health. But also it has helped me shift from perfectionism into living and striving for excellence. So excellence, if the difference between perfection and excellence, if perfectionism is a double-edged sword, then excellence is really the path to growth. And this is how we grow when we were trying to live in excellence. And so excellence in and of itself is very growth oriented. It's focused on a continuous improvement of self and learning. And part of that learning and that continuous growth is acceptance of mistakes, acceptance of all of yourself, all the flaws, all the strengths, all the weaknesses, all the everything that is there, every single part of yourself. That is part of being growth oriented. And that's why your growth can be continuous, because part of growth is rest. Part of growth is admitting mistakes and making mistakes. You can't actually grow if you're not making mistakes. Did you know that? It's taken me a lot of years to actually realize that is the best way to grow, is to make mistakes and to change and to admit those mistakes and take radical responsibility for things. Okay. So then excellence also is having realistic goals for ourselves. So this means that they're achievable things, and that when we achieve these small things, these goals that we have, all these little mini goals, rather than not just big hairy goals, we celebrate them. And that is what gives us forward progress. So having these realistic achievable goals and celebrating them is what puts us forward, is what gets us to the next level. That's what gets us to the next part of our journey and growth, and gets us to the next moment of rest. Again, it's not I have to do all these things so I can rest. It's I'm going to rest so I can do all of these things. It's just such a mind shift. And there's a balance there when we're talking about excellence, when we're doing something towards excellence, is that it encourages action and productivity, but balanced with rest. So it's not just I'm going to rest and sit here, and then when I feel like doing it, I'm going to do it. No, it's I'm sitting here and resting so that I can have the growth and the productivity to actually do the thing. And all of this, when we're talking about excellence, this whole idea, when we're doing something with excellence rather than striving for perfection, brings us fulfillment. So whatever we're doing, it's going to fulfill us. And this leads to a sense of accomplishment and overall satisfaction in our life. And I can tell you the last 6 months, maybe around 8 months of my life, I have had this growing fulfillment in my life. Definitely the last 5 or 6 months, I have been feeling fulfilled, accomplished, and just I have this growing joy and satisfaction in my life that I've been missing for quite a long time. And there's lots of reasons for it. But one of the big shifts is moving out of perfectionism and moving into excellence, and just having this whole mind shift of resting to be productive rather than being productive to earn rest. Okay. So how do I want to do this? I think, I want to talk about how we shift from perfection to excellence. I think what I have done is the biggest thing is I had to start setting really realistic goals for myself, where I was at. And this meant breaking down these really large, hairy goals, this visionary kind of stuff, into smaller, manageable things that I could do for myself. And as I've gone through many liminal transitions, and some of these transitions that I'm in right now, this has been the case where I felt so overwhelmed by this vision, or I felt so overwhelmed by the things that I wanted to accomplish. And I found myself very easily falling back into perfectionism with things. And one of the projects that I was working on took a huge physical toll on me. I have been refurbishing and redoing this RV that I'm going to be living in full time. And I wanted to have it done. I wanted to have it done, and I had this vision for it. And I literally worked myself to the bone, because I have this crazy work ethic where I just work for hours and hours and hours and don't take breaks and rest, because that's the perfectionist in me, and just go, 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 go. I'm a worker bee. And I found myself doing this, and I had to really pull back and allow myself to maybe not hit the unrealistic goal of having everything done within 2 weeks, which I was still working full time. So really it was 2 weekends that I wanted to refurbish this whole thing. And there was just no way that was going to happen. So it took me a good while. It took me, a month, and there are still things I need to do in it. I am living in it now, but there are still things I need to do in it at some point to fully rehab it and fully refurbish it. And so, but it's totally livable. It's beautiful. I love it. But I had to really break down the big goal into smaller, manageable pieces. And it's going to have to be a longer term thing rather than just 2 weekends. Brianna, I don't know what you were thinking. Perfectionist Brianna there. And then the second thing is having self-compassion. This has been such a game changer for me. I had to start practicing self-compassion in very radical ways. And I had to be kind to myself, and I had to avoid self-criticism. Whenever that critical inner voice starts coming out in my rude brain, I have to just automatically shut it down, because if I let it go for even a moment, it just wants to take off. And part of this is because part of my upbringing was in a very critical environment. And so it's just very comfortable for me to be criticized. Even as an adult, there was unspoken criticism that I received quite a bit. And so it's comfortable for me to receive criticism. And so even though it's uncomfortable and it's awful and horrible, it's easy for me to fall back into that and to listen to it. So as soon as I start being very self-critical and allow my rude brain, I have to shut it down. And one of the ways that I do this with being compassionate with myself is making sure that I am in accountability with someone. And I have to talk to them and let them know my rude brain is working. This is what rude brain is saying, and they have to help me shut it down. I need help. Admitting you need help is such a strength. Admitting a vulnerability and a weakness with a safe person is one of the strongest things you can ever do. It's one of the most courageous things you can ever do. And it's a game changer. It really has allowed me to truly be self-compassionate and put myself on this path of emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical health. The third thing is we have to embrace our mistakes. We have to view opportunities as learning, as a way to learn and grow. That has been a huge shift for me, has helped all these other things about having realistic goals and being self-compassionate. The fourth thing is we have to focus on our progress and not on perfection, right? It's a no-brainer. But how do we do that? Is we celebrate all the small victories. We celebrate and acknowledge effort. And we do it not in a way that is like, oh, I guess I'll do this. No, we do it. Like, we do it boldly. Like, I am celebrating this thing that I have done, that I am doing, that I am working towards, because it's amazing and it's awesome. And it is hyping yourself up. I don't know why we feel like we can't ever hype ourselves up. When we hype ourselves up and we affirm ourselves, this is a beautiful thing, and it fuels us being able to help others. And when we don't help ourselves first, we can't help others. We have to hype ourselves up first. We have to make sure that we're being encouraged and hyped up by others so that we can help other people. So it starts with us. If we don't believe in ourselves, nobody else is going to believe in us either. And this is not wrong. This is not a moral failure. This is not a morality thing. This is just, we have to believe in ourselves. We have to trust ourselves, and we have to focus on our progress and not always the end goal of what we're trying to get to. We have to celebrate the progress as we go. And then I think the fifth thing that really helps us shift from perfectionism into living in excellence is prioritizing our overall well-being. And this means that we have to take care of ourselves. You know, we talked about this self-care. We have to prioritize our sleep, prioritize diet and exercise, prioritize doing things that we enjoy doing. We should have enjoyment in this life. Pleasure is a good thing. It is not a morally wrong thing to have pleasure, to have excitement, to enjoy good things, to look forward to things, to do things for ourselves. And so this is part of living in excellence and not living in perfection. Okay, so if we find ourselves maybe flirting with perfection, or we know that we're like a recovering perfectionist, is what I call myself, there are some questions we can ask ourselves. And so to distinguish if we're working in excellence or we're actually working in and from perfection. And there are some categories. There are, I think, 5 categories is what I counted out. There are 5 categories of that we tend to fall into. That's motivation, standards, self-talk, and our emotional state, and our behaviors. So we can ask these kind of questions surrounding these areas of our life to see if we're actually living in excellence or if we're trying to live in and through perfection. So in motivation, what is driving me to do well in this? What is my motivation? What is driving me to do well in this? The second question is, am I motivated by external validation from others, or am I internally satisfied by what I'm doing? And do I find joy in this process, or am I solely focused on the end result? And some examples. I want to give some examples of this so that we also can help distinguish. So in an everyday life example of our motivation is, if you enjoy learning new skills and hobbies for like your personal satisfaction, right? That is excellence. Conversely, when you push yourself to be the best at everything, even if it's not enjoyable, that's perfectionism in your everyday life, right? In your work, the motivation. If we're striving to be the best at our job and we're consistently improving our skills, that is excellence. But if you're driven by a need to be seen as perfect to avoid criticism in your job, that's striving in perfection. In your home life, if you enjoy creating a comfortable and welcoming home environment, that is excellence. But if you're feeling the pressure to maintain a perfectly clean home and organized in case somebody comes over, that's perfectionism. I definitely have issues with that one. That is a hard one for me. And then I think the last category example that I want to give you is in relationships. And so if your motivation, in a motivation, like you value open and honest communication and you strive to build strong supportive relationships, that is living in excellence. Whereas if you're fearing rejection and you're seeking constant validation from others, that is living and doing the thing in perfectionism. Okay. So the next area where we can ask questions to distinguish whether we are working in excellence or in perfection is standards. So are my standards realistic and achievable? Or am I being unrealistic and inauthentic? The second question is, am I willing to compromise quality to meet this thing that I'm trying to do? Or am I living and putting myself under constraints, undesirable constraints? Do I hold myself and others to the same standards? Or do I hold myself to a higher impossible standard? So with some examples of this then, in our everyday life when it comes to standards, if you're aiming to cook a healthy meal, and most of the time, like you try to cook healthy meals most of the time, but you do allow for, the occasional treat, occasional indulgences, junk food, that is living in excellence. Whereas if you're stressing over every single meal, you're aiming for perfection for nutrition and presentation of that meal, then you're living in perfection in that area of your life, in your everyday life. A work example, if you're setting a realistic deadline for yourself and you prioritize those tasks effectively and you prioritize rest, that is living in excellence. But if you take on excessive workloads and you're striving for perfection in every detail and you're not willing to share the load with other people, that is living in perfection. You're trying to do all the things and you're taking on too much. You're not able to do it. A home example for standards, if you are aiming to keep your home tidy, but you're not getting stressed over minor messes, that's living in excellence because you can clean the mess up. That's living in excellence. But if you obsess over cleanliness and order and you spend an excessive amount of time cleaning and organizing and an excessive amount of money in cleaning and organizing, then you're striving for perfectionism. That's not living in excellence. And then our relationship example, when we're setting our standards, are you setting a realistic expectation for your partners and your friends? Are you allowing for grace and compassion and empathy? That is living in excellence. But are you holding unrealistic expectations for others? And do you become easily disappointed when your friends and your family and your partner is not meeting them? That's striving for perfectionism in relationships. Okay, when we're talking about self-talk. So self-talk questions that we can ask ourselves to distinguish if we're in excellence or if we're in perfectionism. How do I talk to myself when I am making a mistake or I made a mistake? Am I being compassionate or am I being critical? We got to know the difference there. And do I focus on my shortcomings or am I focused on my strengths when I'm doing something? And then the last question when we're talking about our self-talk in distinguishing between excellence and perfectionism is, am I comparing myself to others? Or am I focused on my forward progress? So examples of our everyday life in self-talk. I made a mistake, but I'm going to learn from it. That is living in excellence. Whereas self-talk of, I'm a failure for messing up that recipe. That is perfectionism, plain and simple. An example of self-talk when we're talking about workloads. When we say to ourselves, I'm really proud of my hard work on this project. I'm really proud of myself. That is living in excellence. Versus, I'm not good enough and I'm never going to be as successful as others when we're talking about our work. That's perfectionism. Talking about home, a self-talk example is, it's okay if the house isn't perfect all the time. That is living in excellence. It's giving compassion to yourself. Or conversely, when the house is a mess, we're saying, I'm a terrible housekeeper. My house is always a mess. That kind of self-talk is perfectionism. And then the last example, our relationship example for self-talk is, I'm grateful for my loving and supportive relationships. Because there's going to be flaws in it. There's going to be expectations that aren't met, right? But I'm still thankful for them, having that gratitude for those relationships, even when they're not perfect. That is living in excellence. Versus, I'm not good enough to be loved. And I'm never going to find someone who truly sees me for me and loves me for who I truly am. I need to mask. That is living in perfectionism in our relationships. Okay, emotions. Emotion questions we can ask ourselves when dealing with our emotions to distinguish between perfectionism and excellence. How do I feel when I miss the mark? When I make a mistake, how do I actually feel? Do I feel shame and guilt? Do I feel anxiety? Do I feel stress? The second question is, do I feel accomplished when I complete a task? Or do I always feel like I need to do more? Do I need to strive for more? Is there more that I need to do? Or can I actually be finished and be proud of my work? And the third question is, can I enjoy the process of working towards this goal? Or am I so focused on the end result and feeling super stressed and overwhelmed by meeting that end result? Those are great questions to help us distinguish. So then our examples of emotions. So the thought of, I feel really disappointed when a recipe doesn't work out, but I don't let it ruin my day. or I don't let it ruin the meal itself, the time that I have in the meal with my loved ones. That is living in excellence. Whereas I become really overwhelmed and anxious when things aren't going perfectly. And the recipe is ruined, and I've ruined dinner, and I've ruined this time that we've had together, and it's awful. That is trying to strive for perfectionism in our everyday life. And a work example would be when you experience stress or frustration at work, you're still able to manage that stress effectively and still do your job. That's living in excellence. But if you're suffering from chronic stress all the time in your job and anxiety due to constant pressure and you're not able to perform your job, that is trying to live in perfectionism, because you're letting all the stress and pressure of everything actually affect you, and you paralyze yourself. And then a home example is you feel really frustrated when your house gets messy, but you don't let it ruin your mood. Like, it doesn't shift and change the whole mood of the home. That is living in excellence. But if you become very anxious and overwhelmed by clutter and disorganization, that is living in perfectionism. This is me. Like, this is an area that I really have a hard time, is my house and keeping things clean and organized. Like, I just feel, and a lot of it has to do with growing up. Everything was perfect at home. The house was always clean. There was an impossible standard to live up to. And I've carried it with me my entire adult life. Okay. So the last category is our behavior then. So behavior type questions we can ask ourselves to distinguish between excellence and perfection is, do I procrastinate to avoid tasks that I fear that I can't do perfectly? Or am I willing to receive help and feedback from others on something that I'm working on? And do I celebrate the successes that I have, or am I downplaying them? So these are some really great questions we can ask ourselves. And these are questions that I've been asking myself to distinguish, am I being in perfectionism or am I living in excellence? So our examples, our last examples when we're talking about behavior in our everyday life, an example would be, I'm experimenting with a new recipe and cooking techniques in general. Just being willing to adventure, being willing to risk, being willing to try a new recipe, even if it's going to get messed up. That is living in excellence. But if you only stick to your tried and true recipes out of fear or failure of that recipe not going through, not being willing to try new foods, being willing to try new things, that's living in perfectionism, because you don't want to disappoint, or there's so much thing, you don't want to fail. That's living in perfectionism. A work example would be, I ask for help when I have a need, and then I delegate tasks appropriately at work. When you're working on something, that is living in excellence, trusting other people to do these tasks appropriately and taking on an appropriate amount of work for yourself. But if I hesitate to ask for help when I need it at work, and I take on too much responsibility and I'm over my capacity, that is working in perfectionism at work, because we're afraid, we're living in fear. A home example of our behavior, of how our behavior can tell us if we're living in excellence or in perfectionism. A behavior would be encouraging my family members to help with the chores and maintain the shared living space. Like, encouraging them, asking them to do these things, having them be a part of it and not having to do it all by myself. That is living in excellence. Whereas if you're micromanaging the household tasks, doing it all yourself because nobody else can do it as good as you, and you then become resentful when others aren't meeting the standards or aren't helping you because you're micromanaging them, that is living in perfectionism. This whole area of my life has been a mess for a very long time, and I've been really, I just hit my horn. I've been really working on trying to heal this area of my life. I'm so much better than what I was, but I still have a long way to go, I think. And then the last category is our relationships. So the example here is, and when we're talking about behavior to distinguish between excellence and perfectionism, is, am I expressing my needs and my wants honestly and respectfully? Or am I avoiding expressing my needs and wants out of fear of rejection or disapproval? The first one is living in excellence, and the second one is trying to strive for perfection because you don't want to rock the boat and you want to be a people pleaser. So I hope this has helped you to see that it is a very fine line, but there are distinguishable differences between living in excellence and living in perfectionism. Bold Living Challenge is, I want you to ask yourself some of these questions that I gave you. Look at your motivations, look at your standards, look at your self-talk, look at your emotions, and look at your behavior. Ask yourself some of these questions, and then really evaluate, am I living and striving for perfection, or am I living and striving for excellence? All right, guys, have a great weekend.